good evening to those in Asia, and welcome to this seminar on the role of aid to middle-income countries. My name is Mark Plant. I'm a Senior Policy Fellow at the Center for Global Development, and I will be the moderator for this event. As the financing needs of developing countries grow as a result of the COVID-19 crisis, there is also a growing debate about the use of increasingly scarce official development assistance, also known as ODA, or simply aid. These resources, granted to developing countries or loaned at heavily concessional rates, have been the mainstay of donor finance for many years. While there's an a priori case for these funds to be allocated to the poorest countries, in fact, we see that aid has been used in countries with very diverse per capita income levels and varying needs. And in the last decade, we have seen China become a major donor throughout the world, with a diversity of instruments, modalities, and partners. What should be the rationale for distributing scarce aid? How does China's presence as a donor change the equation for donors who have been assisting developing countries for a longer time? Is China following a different model? And what can the longer term donors learn from China's aid strategy and vice versa? Briefly, those are the subjects for today's discussion. We have a distinguished panel with us today. Let me introduce first our guest panelists. First, we have Mr. Taidong Zhou, the head of Global Development Division at the China Center for International Knowledge on Development. We're joined by Mr. Dizhang Jia, Professor of International Political Economy at the School of International Studies at Beijing University. Also joining us is Ms. Zholi Zhu, Professor at the College of Humanities and Development Studies and the Dean of the College of International Development and Global Agriculture at the China Agricultural University. Mr. Stefano Manservisi, who is a distinguished non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development and the former Director General for International Development Cooperation at the European Commission, is our last panelists. And our presenter today will be my colleague, Ranil Dissanayake, who's a policy fellow at the Center for Global Development. We'll also be joined by our co-author for the paper that Ranil is presenting, Charles Kenny, sorry. Before we get started with Ranil's presentation, let me remind the audience that the CGD events team will be collecting questions from the audience. You can ask us questions 3 different ways. On Twitter, you can use @CGDev or #CGDTalks. By email, you can email us at events@cgdev.org, and you can use the question facility on YouTube. So with those introductory remarks, let me turn the floor over to Ranil for his presentation. Ranil.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to share my screen so that everyone can see the presentation now. But I would also encourage people, if you have the chance, to read the full paper. I'm going to give you a whirlwind tour of our analysis, but the paper, which is entitled "What is the Role of Aid in Middle-Income Countries?" goes into much more detail and provides a lot more of the underlying data. So I hope you can all see the presentation now. So I'll talk you through the analysis of our paper, which essentially just asks, what is different about ODA that is used in middle-income countries? And before I start, just a sort of quick refresher on what we mean when we say ODA. It's official development assistance. It has a very specific definition, and that includes some minimum level of concessionality, as Mark alluded to, but also that it must have the promotion of the economic development and welfare of developing countries as its main objective. That is actually a rather generous, encompassing definition. There is a lot of different things that you could do that qualify as official development assistance. Not all of those things have the same sort of value for the welfare of the poor. And the paper that we're presenting today really draws its inspiration from a stylized fact, which is that most ODA is always, has always been, spent outside of the very poorest countries in the world. The graph that we're showing here shows the poorest 26 countries in the world, selected because they normally account for around 10% of the global population, versus the ODA spent in other ODA eligible countries. And what you see is that it's always been a minority. And it's varied a little bit over time from between 30% in 1989, when China was actually one of the recipients, down to around 14% in 2005. And today it sort of hovers around the 20% mark. And China is now a substantial donor, which just that fact gives us some idea of how much the world has changed in this period. But one thing that hasn't changed is that most ODA is going outside of the poorest places in the world. And this is generally true across most donors. There are a few outliers. The UK and the US tend to put a little bit more, and Sweden, of course, tend to put a little bit more in the lower income countries, the poorer end of the spectrum. Japan puts more in middle income countries. But in general, most donors give quite a lot of ODA to middle income countries. And you'll notice that China is not one of the countries listed in this table. From their most recent white paper in 2021, we can see that China gives about half, 46% of its ODA to least developed countries. But it should be pointed out that LDCs are not the same thing as lakes. They include some richer countries as well. And I will come back to this point, but the data is not fully comparable, so it's difficult to put them in the same table and judge them on the same grounds. So, starting from this stylized fact, we could ask 3 questions, but we're only going to actually ask one of them today. We could ask, what is the overall right amount of global ODA? We're not going to get into that. That is a loaded question, and frankly, the answer is it could always be higher, really. The second question is, does the distribution look right? That is, should we be giving more of our available ODA to poorer countries? There's a strong case to make that should generally be the case, but again, it's not the question that we're going to be answering today. The question that we'll look at today is very specifically, if you're going to use ODA in countries at different levels of GDP per capita, how would the use of ODA in those countries vary? What is different about spending ODA in middle income countries? And so, as I said, we're not making the case for an optimal distribution of ODA. Instead, we just want to recognize that many countries are going to be spending in lower middle income countries and even upper middle income countries. And we want to contribute to making that ODA as effective and efficient as possible, so that we do as much good as we can with this scarce resource, and also we use it parsimoniously to achieve the most good with the least effort. And we will propose a set of 3 screens and 4 principles, which is a bit complicated, but I hope it will make sense when we go through the paper. And we will then have a quick look at how these principles match up with the current reality. So, not to belabor the point, but the reason this matters so much is that as countries get richer, what you can reasonably expect ODA to achieve through brute force changes dramatically. The graph on the left lines up the poorest 51 or so countries in the world according in order of their market GDP, and it compares their cumulative GDP to the total amount of global ODA, which in, I think this year that we're using here, 2018, was around $166 billion. The poorest 23 countries in the world, that takes you from Burundi up to Guinea, have a cumulative GDP of around double global ODA flows. If you add a few more countries to get up to Nigeria, that their cumulative GDP becomes 11 times global ODA. Add 8 more countries beyond that to include India, and now you're around 30% of GDP. The point is, and this is reinforced by the graph on the right, the size of ODA in all but the poorest countries is too small to move things through brute force. Simply pushing this money through these economies is not going to fundamentally alter them. That may be the case in low-income countries, but it's certainly not the case in even lower middle-income countries for the most part. And throughout this presentation, I will be using the shorthand low-income countries and lower middle-income countries, but it's good to take a digression for a moment and point out that we shouldn't put too much emphasis on the category that countries fall under, but think more in terms of what their GDP per capita is. there is not that great a difference between a country that is just below the lower middle income country cutoff and a country that is just above that cutoff. They have similar problems, but in general, as countries become richer, the typical challenges that we have focused on in poor countries become rarer conditions. What that means, well, the rest of the presentation will think a little bit about what that means for how, and where we spend money in slightly richer countries. So we propose that for all ODA, actually, there are 3 screens that we should assess its suitability against. And applying those 3 screens will give you a specific approach to using ODA in middle-income countries. The first screen is the development challenge screen, which is simply that aid should focus on the most significant human challenges in poor countries or for poor people. And this is high poverty, mortality, disease, similar things like this. In middle-income countries, where there are relatively fewer poor people in general, and where their problems of mortality and disease are less broadly spread across the population, that means focusing on specific regions or specific sectors or specific place populations where those challenges are concentrated. The second screen is around expected impact, which is arguing that wherever we use ODA, we should be allocating it according to our expectation that if used well, it will make a difference. In middle-income countries, where, as we've seen, the size of the economy dwarfs the potential size of ODA, ODA needs to have an outsized impact, and that normally means not just achieving things directly, but shifting what other actors do. And the third screen that we propose is political economy, which is that ODA must either be consistent with the existing political realities in a country, or it must be able to realistically shift them, because otherwise it's essentially good money after bad. And in middle-income countries, we are asking, can we use ODA in such a manner as to shift the political and economic incentives in those countries? So I'll give you one example for a sector which is picked because it's an important sector for China, which is economic development. On the development challenge and the expected impact screen, in fact, the first question that we need to answer really is, why do we need to do external support at all? Most middle-income countries have pretty good market access to finance. We need a clear justification of market failure or government inability to act in order to sort of justify the use of ODA. And the expected impact screen is absolutely critical here. In middle-income countries, ODA used directly from economic development projects is generally going to be relatively small compared to the size of the problem and the size of the economy. And it's very important that we then think about how we strategically use that scarce resource to achieve some sort of outsized impact relative to the size of the flow. And that also means that actually it offers protection against white elephant projects, the building of politically popular but sort of economically meaningless infrastructural projects. Now, there are different ways that you might achieve this. One is that a small amount of ODA might be used to leverage either other private or public lending, although, to be frank, the evidence around this is relatively weak. The second way that you could use it is to use small targeted efforts which are aimed at correcting a specific market distortion or at shifting the incentive of a specific actor that could generate larger change. And that will typically not be in the form of massive projects, but small grants and technical assistance. And thirdly, we suggest that in general, this will also point to the use of multilateral channels, because that aggregates the action of multiple donors and gives them a little bit more heft relative to the size of the economy they're working in. So applying these 3 screens, we generate 4 principles for using ODA effectively in middle-income countries. The first, and this is true of any country, is that any use of ODA must clear all 3 screens. That is, there must be an development challenge being addressed, there must be some clear expected impact, and it must be consistent with the political economy or aim to shift the political economy. There is far more that you can do that clears all 3 screens than there is money. The prioritization is critical. Secondly, the right instrument must be applied. Because there's so much more that you can do than there is money, you need to make sure that whatever application of ODA you're using is an efficient use of scarce ODA. And that means strategically using loans where loans are appropriate, technical assistance where that is appropriate, and hoarding that 100% grant-funded ODA for very specific uses, generally in the poorest countries. And then the third and the fourth principles, I think, apply specifically to, or rather have a particular interest when thinking about China's role in global development. The first is that ODA in middle-income countries in particular should not be looking to replace state capacity. It should be looking to bring forward state capacity. It is not tenable, especially in middle-income countries, to be spending repeatedly to buy outcomes. Instead, we should be thinking very much about how do we create the capacity and incentives in a country to generate those outcomes themselves. And you may argue that does not seem to be the modus operandi of a lot of Chinese ODA, although that's rather it's an anecdotal statement, and I'll come back to that in the end. And then fourthly, using the multilateral system for any single donor in a middle-income country is unlikely to have sufficient policy or financial clout to induce substantive change independently. Again, there could be a case to make that China is sui generis in this sense, or one of very few donors where the economic importance and the size of the projects that can be put forward may actually may render that fourth principle sometimes unnecessary. So given these screens and the application of these screens and the 4 principles for using ODA in mix, we should observe that ODA in low-income countries and middle-income countries are rather different. We should see that, on average, you see smaller uses of grant funding in middle-income countries compared to low-income countries. We should see generally a different set of objectives in middle-income countries because their challenges are different. And we should see a different balance of instruments because the most efficient way of achieving objectives will be different. And we should see more use of multilateral channels. And going to the data, that's not really what we see. So looking at ODA across the average commitment size against GNI per capita of the recipient, we don't see a dramatic decline in the size of ODA projects with income. It does sort of slightly gently decline, but that's mainly driven by a few outliers, and it's certainly not as steep as you would expect. In general, most projects are very, very small everywhere, and everywhere the value of ODA is driven by a few huge projects everywhere. So there is no real evidence of using these small targeted approaches of grant ODA in middle-income countries. Secondly, we don't see a dramatic difference in the sectors of interest across income categorizations. The one exception is that enormous bar of economic development programs in low and middle-income countries. But in general, the pattern seems similar, and the balance of instruments is driven more by the sector than by the income category of the recipient. So we're not seeing this sort of disambiguated approach to what the efficient instrument for ODA is, or the appropriate development challenge as countries become richer. And we also, in fact, see that the use of multilateral channels declines with income as incomes increase. And it's generally in low-income countries that multilateral channels are used most. Now, to some extent, this is driven by the number of fragile states among the low-income countries, but even restricting the analysis to non-fragile states, the same general pattern is observed. Maybe this reflects the political return to being seen to be active in a middle-income country is higher than in a low-income country, which incentivizes donors to operate bilaterally. But in any case, that does not seem to be, that certainly doesn't fit with the principles that we propose, and it certainly doesn't seem to suggest that we're trying to aggregate our heft to achieve the most good we can in richer places. Now, somewhat unusually for a seminar which is an event which is focused on China, the foregoing analysis hasn't actually mentioned China all that much. And there are two big reasons for this, which I would be really interested to hear from panelists and from the audience how they what they think. The first is that we simply don't know about as much about what is being done on what terms and where in China. Looking at the different sources of data available, they all have weaknesses. So the aid data, project level information, is probably the most detailed and disaggregated data, but it's not fully comprehensive. And the official sources and the point in the middle, the size carry data, are more comprehensive, but they're much more aggregated. So it's hard to tell if the principles are being applied across different countries. From what we can glean from official publications, for example, we can see that more Chinese aid is being aimed at poorer countries, or at least LDCs. But it's really hard to go, that's a broad statement, and it's hard to get into enough detail to actually assess this. The second point is that when we talk about Chinese engagement in poor countries, we typically don't define exactly who we're talking about. And there's a broad range of actors. So state institutions, state-owned banks, private firms using state financing, and purely private entities that are engaged in developing countries. And they're often lumped together to talk about Chinese impact in developing countries. And it's not clear that this is an appropriate framing. We need much more conceptual clarity before we even start the task of asking how Chinese aid is being used in developing countries. And to answer these questions, we need much more transparency. But there doesn't seem to be much promise of that, even in the 2021 white paper. Nevertheless, and this is my final slide, this all does raise some questions. And the first question is really, to what extent does the screens we suggest make sense to assess Chinese aid with? Is there a defined process for thinking about what the expected impact of an individual project is? How is it defined? Who governs this? We can see that there are objectives that are now set out in the new white paper, but it's not clear how they're going to be operationalized. Secondly, the political economy screen in particular is complicated by the sheer size and influence of China's economy and sometimes its projects. And that means that it could plausibly shift partner country policies or entire private sectors. And we need to have some way of thinking about whether that gravity is being applied sort of sensibly and what impacts it's having. And then the second question is around the four principles. China has an extremely wide portfolio of instruments, and this wide portfolio of instruments is, I think, a very clear strength. But it's also not clear that there is a process for selecting the right instrument in the right place, or whether this is done almost in an ad hoc manner. And finally, there is not a great deal of evidence, anecdotally, admittedly, that the Chinese approach is about building state capacity and supporting governments to deliver its own functions, rather than directly delivering large infrastructure projects or other sort of technical support. And it would be interesting to understand from the panelists whether they think that's true or whether there is this sort of broader approach at work. I'll stop there because I think I may have run over somewhat. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranil. A very interesting presentation. Let's turn now to our panelists, and I would like to remind our panelists that each of you has 10 minutes. I'll give you a bit of a warning at the 8-minute mark. So if first we could hear from Mr. Zhou. Are you on?
I'm here. Thank you,
There we go.
Mark, and thank you, Rania,
We see you
for
and we hear
your.
you.
Can, can you hear
Speak
me?
a little louder, I think.
Oh,
Right.
okay. Let me.
Very faintly.
Okay. How about this? How about now? Still no?
I think we need a little more volume, so
Oh,
I'm not sure what's
can you hear me now?
Try this one.
better.
Better? Okay.
That's perfect. There you go. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. And thanks, Rania. I think Rania posed a framework, but also posed a lot of questions regarding China's foreign aid. I don't think I can answer them like one by one, but I wanted to maybe contribute to the discussion sort of from three aspects. One is sort of my own reading on the white paper. The second one is on sort of China's experience as an aid recipient. And then maybe in the end, sort of China's current situation in trilateral cooperation and why, China's aid maybe is in the way that is discussed now, maybe differing from what Rania may expect in many ways. So I will try in 10 minutes. So from the latest white paper, I think one of the perspective we can see about this is, this convergence or divergence issue that has been around like for many years. So whether China is converging with the traditional donors or, we are diverging part. So I think from this white paper, there are very outstanding features that China is converging, like at least I think, much better than the previous ones in the international development cooperation discourse. So one of course is I think there are much more information in this white paper than the previous ones. I mean, Rania mentioned that there are still many more details needed to be there, but this is still progress. So in terms of length, actually, this white paper is actually much longer than the last two combined. It covered sort of concepts, the origins of China's aid, and then the clear objectives, like China's aid is linked with sort of foreign policies, BRI, SDGs, humanitarian aid, and also talked about a sort of supporting state-owned capacity building, which Rania emphasized, and then also prospects. So I think, from at least from the content is very comprehensive. And then in terms of the budget, I think everybody knows there, it's like before, it's an aggregate number and it's regional, and then, we can see the different components. So that I don't need to go to the detail. And then, there are several, I think, aspects that why I'm saying, this is sort of converging with the international sort of trend. The one thing, of course, is, the emphasis on SDGs, because SDGs is a global agenda. And then, if we see the first sort of white paper, we may not see that much, many sort of global discourse or international languages there. The second one is also about increasing attention to sort of software or human welfare, how to say, capacity building part, sort of livelihood. The previous two white papers, you see a lot of emphasis on the big projects, economic projects, infrastructure projects. Now, there are more sort of attention to the sort of softer side. And then the third part, I think, is sort of, there are parts talking about the sort of use of partner countries system and the capacity building. So that's starting, I mean, we cannot like change the system the one night, but that process starts. So I think for the past maybe 5 years, China has piloted, I think, several projects in around maybe 20 countries, for sort of self-building using the country system to implement China's aid projects. So that's changing. And then we see there are many rich aid project examples, especially when it's regarding to the aid with BRI. You see many project level examples, although there are not details, but you see the project names. And I think that provide some clues for further research, if you wanted to see how that aid projects are working. And then the fifth one, of course, is the diverse partnerships, with many more sort of partners. So I think That's why I think, it's actually sort of increasing towards sort of current trends. But of course, I think some of the limits Rania mentioned, including maybe no data at a country or project level, and then, largely bilateral, the multilateral contribution maybe is still limited. But it's also because the China's management of multilateral cooperation is also very fragmented. So, I mean, the white paper covers some, but it cannot cover all of that. So, different ministries have sort of cooperation mechanisms with different UN agencies. So I think, nowadays maybe it's very hard to aggregate or to collect all of them, but I think China will be trying that part in the future. So that's my own sort of short understanding of the white paper. The second part, I think, in terms of China's using aid, I think now, if we're looking back for 4 decades, I think China has used ODA very well. Myself, I managed the sort of UNDP's assistance to China for 10 years. And of course, engaged like in many bilateral ones, EU, British, OSAID, Australia, all the aid. So I think there are several ways, which I think, is actually China is following in its aid. One thing, of course, is to sort of, the recipient country is in the driver's seat. I think when we are receiving aid, China, I think, is sort of trying its ways to, maintain, like we try to know what we need, and we express this to the donors, and we sort of somehow, get that from the donors. So these are done, by sort of, I think, we have sort of host ministries for the key donors, and we try to link sort of the aid framework, whether it's sort of a country program, all the stuff, with China's 5-year plans. And then in the process, I think in the China's management part, we have a coordinating agency, whether it's Ministry of Finance or Ministry of Commerce. We will sit together with the different key ministries to understand their priorities in development, and then to sort of then propose the project list, and then we feed back to the donors to sort of link this together. So, in the very beginning, I think it's more projects on infrastructure, on many of this, economic development. But then when it comes to the later stage, it's more about management skills, ideas, information sharing. So there are a lot of like actually Chinese delegations to many of the developed countries to understand their practice, sort of the technical assistance part. I think that played a lot of a big role in China's opening and the reform process. So I think that's, in general, I mean, how China has managed the aid part. And then in terms of the third part, I think not mentioned in Rania's question, but I think is in the original concept note is sort of the engagement in China in trilateral cooperation. So we did a mapping on this. So I wanted to maybe give 4 or 5 sort of points from that reading, how different Chinese stakeholders are viewing China's participation in the trilateral cooperation. The first one, I think, is, of course, now a wide range of Chinese institutions are now engaged in trilateral cooperation. I think since largely from 2005, but maybe after 2008. So we surveyed like about, I think, 30 institutions, but 28 of them have done some sort of trilateral cooperation. But I think, it depends on how we are defining this, but that's another issue. And then the second part, of course, is the trilateral cooperation, like I mentioned before, is very fragmented. So different institutions, different ministries, working with different agencies, some are overlapping, some are very, very specific or detailed, and there is no sort of clear policy guidance from the Chinese government on how to do this, how to engage in this. And different Chinese ministries are also engaging in different trilateral cooperation initiatives. So I think that's the second sort of feature. The third feature is Chinese institutions tend to engage more with sort of multilateral agencies, UN agencies, instead of sort of bilateral agencies or international non-governmental organizations. That is also pretty clear. And then the sectors and the geography distribution of sort of China's trilateral cooperation is also actually are very concentrated. One is largely in Africa region, the other is Southeast Asia. So in terms of sectors, it's largely like agriculture, healthcare, education, and disaster management. And some also on clean energy. So trilateral cooperation also, while it presents benefits, it also poses a lot of challenges. I think many the Chinese institutions mentioned this because many of them are very actually detailed, because of high cost, a lot of coordination, all this stuff. But I think in the end, when we are talking about, sort of China's global development, and also like, when we are talking about traditional donors development, I think, sometimes we are needed to come back to how China has developed itself. So I think in China's aid to other countries, that logic is largely followed. So, whether it's aid from other countries or, whether this is sort of a non-intervention policy, all these key principles actually are, reflected in the policy making side. So in China's own way of development, we draw sort of ideas, experience from other countries, but we do not like follow everything others said. Now, nowadays, when we are trying to sort of giving aid, we didn't do like sort of system level aid or policy level or, program-wide level. I think it's because we are not so sure that, at least we're definitely working in that country. So I think that's at least from my own reading. So we are trying to see, how this can be linked together, but it's still in the process. My time is up. I think I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zhou. Interesting comments about very much an aid system in transition. Let me turn next to Professor Jia. You have the floor, Professor Jia.
Okay, thank you very much. I come into this more as a scholar who studies what's going on and try to foster some conversations between foreign colleagues and Chinese colleagues, both in academia and in government, who are interested in the issue. About a week ago, we just had another conversation on the white paper, latest white paper on aid with the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs. So also Taidong mentioned a good deal of that. I have 10 minutes. I'll probably cover 4 quick topics. The first is that if you wonder why it's so difficult to get a complete set of data out of China about its aid, it probably has to do with Chinese experience in terms of receiving aid. By far the largest provider of aid on bilateral basis was Japan. And this is very important. It was also called yen loans. And then China did not take the IDA loans, the really low interest loans. So, and as Taidong mentioned, we had separate agencies to relate to the UNDP. There was an entire ministry to relate to the World Bank, although after 1989, that ministry did not survive. So what that means is that you really have a Chinese understanding out of its own experience that aid is just the precursor to investment and trade. No real difference. So in other words, the sort of conceptual questions you may have about development challenges, about political economy impact, and other kind of changing social norms, I don't really think it rings much of a bell for people who were on the receiving end of this. Just get the money, okay, there was the training, there was the implementation. But now there is an opportunity. It's a couple of years old now. You have a new agency for international development. This was meant to copy the Japanese and German approaches of one agency that tries to synchronize others. But you know, the Chinese bureaucracy is very huge. We have about, at the ministerial level, some 15 different ministries that each has its own foreign aid, this poor agency. And I think that I suspect the agency was behind writing that white paper, has a long distance to go. But having said that, I would hope conversations like this can contribute to Chinese government agencies having a better understanding of OECD as a bureaucracy. This is very important. I don't think it's very meaningful at all. Going back to my own participation with coming up with the Chinese response to the Busan conference on donors back in 2007, it has not made much progress at all, because you have scholars like me who think, okay, we need to be more transparent. Then you have those people who, in government, in decision making, who know very little, if anything, about the OECD, but then they are very ideological. They say, well, the OECD is a rich countries club. We have nothing to do with it. Now, one way to resolve this is to have Chinese government officials or those who are more closely affiliated with the government to observe how OECD functions as a bureaucracy, and slowly you build up a team of government agents, bureaucrats who can come back and say, well, this is a lot more about everyday life than, you know, ideology or geopolitics. Now, this approach of having a Chinese secondee at these bureaucracies, multilateral agencies, has worked in terms of how China relates to the IEA, the International Energy Agency. So that's a specific proposal I would have. And also, frankly speaking, it's in every aspect of interest for Chinese statistics, not just aid, statistics about China, to be part of the OECD, regular OECD purview. And I don't need to go on, say more about that. Now, second point I wanted to come to is the South-South cooperation. I don't really think the South-South cooperation resonates that powerfully here in this country as a quote-unquote geoeconomic agenda. China was part of kind of rhetorical part of this, but it never joined the group of 77, and it sometimes allied with G77 in voting, but was not very active. And as a matter of fact, some in China probably had reservations about the revival of the South-South cooperation under the UN framework. 2013, right? If you look at the developments 2013 to 2015, these 3 years, the United Nations had a South-South cooperation office. China announced something called a BRI. Then that later became BRI. That's how the Silk Road. And then you had this Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, you know, reform of the World Bank and whatnot. And now, of course, you have the change of leadership in China. So South-South, in some ways, is not considered a experiment for China to, let's say, pursue, and as is sometimes thought to be, okay, the China must be using the South-South framework as a quote-unquote counterweight to something Western. I doubt that's the case. I think it's more of a competition. If you paid attention, the same Chinese agency, the China Center for International Economic and Technical Exchange, that has been responsible for receiving aid, is now responsible for delivering aid under the South-South framework. You get an idea there. So we need to do more study there. Now, the third point is that Taidong made a good point. You know, I think it's about time when we research agencies like yours and Chinese institutions move forward the discussion about China, is that we use a microscopic approach to look at the project's implementation. And one of the things I think I use in my class is the Lubuge project. That's the first Chinese utilization of World Bank loan. It had a hydro project, okay? And then there's a rich history here to study. Out of this, we can summarize things better, because a lot of times we come sort of start with a large system and then don't really go much of anywhere. There is always comparison. But if we start small, probably we can understand, because just the last sentence in the Lubuge is a project that resulted in far more extensive and long-term impacts in China, far more than just one hydropower plant. I think my time is up. I should stop there. I will be looking forward to any questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhao. Let's turn now to Professor Zhu for her intervention. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Mark. And thank you, Ranil, for your excellent presentation. And all the friends, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. And actually, I would like to share 3 points when after listening to your presentation and the comments, and just come up with 3 points. The first, I will give a general kind of a reflection on this kind of event, very interesting discussions. And secondly, I will come to the question about the rationale for distributing aid in China. And thirdly, will come back to the 3 screens and principles to say how about as a Chinese researchers and the feedback to this. And first of all, I should introduce myself a little bit. Actually, for me, I studied OECD DACA aid when I was a student and working in early days, and so understand more about Western aid, OECD DACA, ODA, logic framework, terms of reference, all these technical words. And then later, after 2011, when I back from a University of Cambridge as a visiting scholar, I then started to working on Chinese aid to Africa, to go to the field to observe what's happening about the Chinese aid in the field, and later also participate in some policy consultation on at a micro level. So these experiences make me provide some kind of feedback to these discussions. I think the discussions are very interesting, but to me it seems like for the when I'm talking about OECD or ODA, all those eight discussions, I would think it's very much about professionalism. When we're talking about the professional, it means all our works in this area will think about carefully about data management, think about evaluation, think about all those terms of reference, all these junk words. But when we move to the Chinese aid, it seems to me, yeah, as 2 experts already said, that Chinese aid is actually at the transformation, at the transition period. But so far, I don't think it's a professionalism. It seems to me it's hard to conceptualize, but it seems like a developmentalism. Maybe we can call it, but it's actually maybe not right. But it means that Chinese aid also emphasize so much about the development. But when they emphasize development, it means that the country, the recipient country, if we can call it, or normally we call it partner countries, they should take the major responsibility of development. And China, as not as a donor, but as a South-South cooperation provider or as a partner, they would like to give assistance or give some facilitation during the process. So it means it's not to give a plan to the country which needs to develop a development, give a kind of a guideline, give a very clear blueprint, give a very clear strategy to say, okay, we need to do this, and then you can get development. Like you mentioned, the third principle, I will come back to it later to say that you can change this by ODA and change the political economy and then change the development. So that's not the philosophy of Chinese aid as far as I understand. So that's the first impression, that professionalism and developmentalism. That's even more clear when I do the field study in Africa. When I cooperate with because in China Agricultural University, we also have a cooperation project in Tanzania. And when we talk with our African partners in the field, they always ask us about what's your budget? What's the terms of reference? How to do the monitoring evaluation? So all these words are very similar, because I know in OECD Dhaka words, they will do it. But actually in our project, it's not like that. We say, oh, sorry, we don't have a kind of very clear blueprint and terms of reference for you. We just provide some money to this project, and we want to facilitate your ideas on development. And if you have any ideas, we can come to assist you and provide a resource, and we mobilize all the resources for your development. So that's kind of lots of a struggle during the mutual learning process. And secondly, I will come back to the very interesting question about the rationale for allocating or distributing aid. I know it's a very critical question. And frankly, I'm not working in the CDCA, and I cannot give an official answer. But as far as I understanding and observation, I found that in history, if we go back to the history about to see, how China allocate aid or delivery aid, we can see in 1950s, starting from the Cold War background context, and then they start from a socialist country. They just do aid to provide aid to socialist country. And then in 1960, when Premier Zhou visited the African countries and like a Bandung conference, like non-alignment, South cooperation, then they started to provide aid to Africa country, and then later expanded to Latin America, to other countries, so to other developing country. And then there's a very big step in the new century, particularly with the forecast started and, like a CDCA started. You can see that more and more partners come up, like, they use new words or new category, like Belt Road countries, where is the Belt Road country? It's not, it's of course, who signed this signed MOU with Belt Road is Belt Road countries. And also, of course, including, lots of African countries. And also there is one regional cooperation platform. For instance, this year we have a China-Africa Cooperation Forum. So all those forums, they will provide or announcement some aid. And basically they will say, okay, demand driven, or they based on the recipient country's request, and then they provide aid. But I know that during the process, there are lots of multiple criteria to deliver aid, allocating resources. Even with coming from the white paper, you can see that basically they are focusing on African, Asia, and Latin American, these countries. So for middle countries, as we calculate, middle income countries, the lower middle income countries also over 30%, the least developing countries 45%. So that's already very, very high. And recently just to the multilateral organizations. So I cannot give a very clear guidelines for how they make the decisions specifically daily. Okay, but you can see that from the process, they have a different category in Chinese context. And lastly, is the screens and principles. I will say the 3 development challenges excellent, expect impact excellent, but it depends on what impact, development or how to co-develop, how to evaluate. But for political mandate from those donor or recipient country, or even in your slide, political economy, or using ODA to used to change the political economy. I don't think that that's fit well in Chinese philosophy. So as far as I understanding in this kind of background, so and for the bring forward the state capacity, and that was very good because you can see from the white paper you will emphasize so much about the state capacity during the process to development. So sorry for the time. I think I'll finish here.
Thank you very much, Professor Xu. Before we go to our last speaker, let me remind the audience that we're taking questions from the audience. You can ask us questions through Twitter @CGDev or #CGDevTalks, by email at events@cgdev.org, and by the YouTube facility. Let me turn now to Mr. Manservisi.
Thank you, Mark. I'm very happy to be with you this afternoon to have a conversation, a very important report, by the way, which is not only talking about how to allocate better, the scarce money, but which I see this as a contribution to global reflection on how to do better in international cooperation at large. So I take that from this point of view. And I was listening very carefully to Ranil first, but also to the Chinese colleagues in order to, let's say, compare a bit the two approaches and to take the most out of it. And it has been very, very interesting, but is a bit something which is missed in translation, if I may say so that in this way. It's a bit like, when you are participating to international conference, that you use what is called a bridge language. When, for example, in the European Union, we have to translate from the Finnish to the Greek. Very often we pass through English, because then there is a common language. Now, I think that in our conversation, the common language is a bit missing. And then, we are talking about grants, concessional finance, middle-income countries and low-income countries, more or less, and impact. But in reality, we are using two different set of criteria in order to identify what we are talking about. I think that this is a problem, and is a problem which must be addressed quickly, and I'll come back on this. But in itself, it's not a problem because one side, let's say, the more traditional, the Chinese should adopt the terminology of the other, but rather because I believe that maybe the two terminologies needs to be a bit reviewed. And I think that there could be a lot of cross-fertilization, if I may say so, in comparing the categories through which China and Chinese experience on one side and the more traditional, let's say, development activities which has been done by the West, by the North, say, has been done during decades. So, I mean, it is a problem. It is a problem to understand each other because just listening to everybody is clearly that we are. There are two different languages, but at the same time, I think that this missing in translation, let's say, is also suggesting what for me is extremely necessary to invent maybe something new which is more in common, and each of the two sides should maybe make an effort of this. But on the other side, I also noticed that there is for the good and for the bad, but there is also a clear convergence. I mean, if I take, for example, the level of spending on middle-income countries, the fact of the matter is that both the more traditional in China are spending more money into this group of countries. Is good, is bad? Let's talk. Your questions, right, were extremely useful. Extremely useful in order to assess. A second element of convergence is that we are talking about, let's say, being inspired by big objectives like addressing climate change, for example, which then is let's say, translated and trickled down into different projects and programs. But this is certainly a communality. And looking at the last white paper, also what has been called, the more attention to human and the software by China, that maybe in the other language, in our language, is to say focusing more on inequalities, is something which is also converging. Then let's see what it means in terms of access to quality services, for example, health, education. Let's see what it means in terms of, let's say, reform of taxation, for example, and distribution. But it is a factor, and this is the second factor of convergence, that we have a big policy framework to which we adhere on both sides, let's say, and I think that also with a certain similarity of pace on the human dimension of all this. Third is the, let's say, the fact that the insistence underlining on the ownership factor. I mean, then it can be called the partner in driving seat. I mean, yes, but ownership is something that among the more traditional donors has always been a principle, you know, maybe defined in a language which is not understood sometimes by China, which is believed to be, I mean, the first warning is doing this, which is perfectly untrue. But this is done in two different ways. But this is, let's say, at least a sort of unifying ambition to be closer to the plans of our partners. So I think that these three elements are showing that, in spite languages which are quite different, there is an objective competency. Now, I come to some points that I would like to suggest. My first point is a question. I mean, being the so-called group of traditional and China, I mean, representing, the biggest actor in terms of the transformation agenda, which has been accelerated by the COVID crisis. Can we afford to give on to keep going on with the two different languages and without finding the way to, let's say, accommodate the needs and the necessity of each side, let's say, even if I don't like this side, But in any case, of these two ways, and to find some form of, let's say, common language and criteria since the outset, upstream, and not just down the street, when we discover that in reality, we are doing similar things a bit everywhere in different ways. So is that affordable that China and the more traditional donors are still talking two languages, or it would not be as a first, let's say, objective, also pushed by your analysis, Tyler, just to say, look, it's time that, we are reflecting a bit and inventing maybe a sort of multilateralism a la carte among us in order to identify concrete way to converge and to decide to converge. And when I say this, I don't mean, the big things. We are all working for SDGs. We are all working for Agenda 2030. We are working for climate change, allegedly, at least. But let's say it's not this. What I mean is to identify some language and some criteria to make our action measurable. Because if it's not measurable, then, we are sharing feelings, but we are not sharing data. And then I know that the Chinese side is very complex in data. By the way, I appreciate it because there are a lot of reforms which are also done, in order to streamline all this. On the more traditional club of donors, I mean, that I know very well, also there is an interest, and there should be an interest of streamlining a lot and maybe deprofessionalize. And I like very much what Mr. Xu said, because it's very true, this sort of profession. And to go back a bit to what is a political, but also a human way of sharing and showing solidarity. I mean, therefore, that then we talk about grants. We should be able to define them in a similar way. I mean, we are close, but we are not there yet. If we talk about concessional finance, I'm sorry, we are defining that in a totally different way. So therefore, it's almost meaningful just to compare notes in this context, because it's totally different. It's totally different also the qualification of private and public. It's totally different. What's going on in the framework of debt relief or debt, let's say, effort, is visible, because there is a problem of is public, is private, is eligible to this and that. And I say that not to criticize the system, but simply to, let's say, emphasize the case that if we want to do better and to want to spend the money better, I think we have the traditional and the Chinese a duty to put order in our houses and to find a way to have common categories in order to measure, to assess, to evaluate. Because if we don't do this, then all the rest is just comparing notes ex post, but there is no chance to do it better. And I think that, I fully appreciate that, the dark criteria are not shared. By the way, I have also personally a lot of criticism vis-a-vis these criteria that I feel a bit oldish. There are other models, the TOSDE, the other, but what I mean is that we need some report. Second point is that, in identifying the partners and therefore the mix, we have to look more, in my view, in terms of, let's say, financing for development mix more than grants or concessional. And then even the dimension of low-income countries and middle-income countries standing alone maybe is not necessarily always relevant. Look at the geographical, let's say, aggregate, or at the geographical projects like the Pan-African Free Trade Agreement, like the ASEAN approach, like the Mercosur in Latin America. So therefore, I think we have also to take that into consideration. We have to look at that together. Third point, on the South-South. One, we take off a bit the dust of the ideological coverage of all this, which is heavy, very heavy. In reality, I think, and the experience that we had as the European Union in the tripartite cooperation is very much interesting. And I think we should share a lot in working the more traditional China and others. In Latin America, for example, it produced a lot of good results on what? In addressing capacities, in addressing administrative shortages of planning, to identify those bottlenecks which are necessary in order to enable changes in middle-income countries, which very much are linked then to, let's say, to wider, let's say, context, which could be geographical and in which low-income countries and middle-income countries are so intertwined that at the end, we have maybe to have a sort of way to read through. So in other terms, and I finish here, I think that convergence should be now, it's time that we set up since the beginning, upstream. There is a lot of communalities. There is a lot of things that we have to rethink on both sides, but the measurement criteria is crucial. And in order to work in an effective way to identify together bottlenecks, which could imply then financing for development mix with more grants, with more concessional or whatever, but depending from the outcome. And we have to define that a bit better together. But I think that there are visible examples of the fact that this could be an important agenda for the months to come. Thanks.
Thank you, Stefano. And thank you to all of you. This is a very interesting conversation. And it really shows, in many ways, we're talking different languages and approaching these things from very different contexts. And we're trying to bring this convergence. I think as I read the white paper, and one of the questions we got was about the emphasis on the white paper on trilateral cooperation with DAC donors in particular. And this is what Stefano was talking about. What's the language? What are the obstructions we see to that trilateral cooperation? I think it's something, in some sense, all sides want, but where are the friction points? Let me ask my panelists what their vision of how it is that we can advance that trilateral cooperation better. Any thoughts on that? Who'd like to just go ahead and speak in? Come in.
Well, if I may, since
yes,
you have to everybody, but just 1 point, at least in the experience I've made, as a practitioner from this point of view. I mean, trilateral has presented a couple of very important elements. One is that precisely it obliges to invent a language which is understood by everybody. And not just a language understood by the two main actors, let's call them donors for a second, but to harmonize this language in view of what is the need of the partner. And I think this is a very pragmatic way, which is pushing the trilateral, in my opinion, very high, in particular with middle-income countries, but potentially as a way to have a sort of small multilateralism, let's say, output-driven. This is, for me, is really important, And this has been a very important experience that has produced a lot of results, including, on the ownership, which is not just unilateral, but is something which is resulting from a sharing. So this is just to be very synthetic, what I think could be important.
Mr. Zhou, are you going to come in?
Thank you. Let me also echo to Stefano. I think the common language, of course, is biggest challenge, one of the biggest challenges. Maybe not just in development cooperation, but I think in many of sort of like, in the communication between China and the world. So when it comes to development cooperation, the very term, that sort of what is development, what is aid, in the Chinese discourse, I think it means many different things from many of the traditional sort of donors, right? So that's of course a big challenge. I think, when it comes to ownership, I understand that, ownership is always emphasized in sort of traditional aid. I saw that word. But then, when it comes to China's sort of understanding of ownership, we largely sort of emphasize the ownership of the partner country's government. But when it comes to sort of traditional donors or ownership, I think it's largely about, sort of civil society, everybody's perspective. So, sometimes I'm just asking you then, in the traditional donors, so in the Chinese, not my personal understanding, in the Chinese critical way, it's like, the Western is sort of having a sort of now inclusive view, sort of in terms of ownership. But then who is making the decision, right? It's still maybe the donor, because you have a resource. And then, the recipient government, you consult, civil society, you consult, private sector, you consult. So I think, I'm not sure whether this understanding is right or not, but the Chinese way is largely simple. So the ownership means demands from the national government. That's largely, I think, then we'll see, whether it fits into China's sort of comparative advantage, whether it meets China's capability. And then if it does, okay, we can do this. So that's why, many, also criticize like China's aid is not that sort of inclusive, because, normally we don't consult with like local civil society, all the stuff, blah, blah things. But then the next step, of course, now I think now there are many sort of voices in China, like say, we definitely need to reach out, to reach the public, because we have got so much costs from the past experience. And then the government is asking, okay, if we are reaching out the society, who is making the decision? So I think that's still, a question, like I posed. So when it comes to Mark's question, I think one of the fixture in the way, in our sort of survey, in sort of in trilateral or tripartite partnership or cooperation, is I think the different procedures, right? Each partner has his own sort of procedure, feedback, reporting ones. And then sometimes it conflicts. Different sides have different requirements, procedures. So I think that's a very, very big challenge on the ground. I'm not sure how this can be done. Whether we can have a pool fund for trilateral cooperation, then like have a sort of a rule that is accepted by, I don't know, by anyone. Can we pilot this? Or that I think will save a lot of trouble. Because in the project management process, many things come from that, and then there will be misunderstandings. They will say, okay, traditional donors will just want to impact us. China will just want to, sort of use the opportunity to engage, and then maybe the recipient country will just want to get the project. They don't want to, So I think that's my understanding. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Professor Jha or Professor Zhu, would you like to come in on this? Okay. No? Ranil, Professor Zhu, so go ahead. Please, Professor Zhu.
Yes, thank you. I think this is a heated debate for trilateral cooperation, particularly at this moment. But as far as I know that, for cooperation, we need, added value, then we can cooperate. It means that 1 + 1 is bigger than 2, then the cooperation get work. For the recipient country, I think for them maybe they can reduce if they can reduce the transact costs. For China they submit a report. For instance, for Australia they also need to submit. So there are lots of work, but they can, if the two donors can coordinate together, and then will be welcome. But for these two kind of aid providers, then it would be lots of work to do, high cost. Like Tedong also emphasized, there are lots of high chances. But I think it's depending on how much our political commitment or mutual trust. Then we, for instance, we can, shall it possible to open a special zone for trilateral cooperation? Like just in the Chinese open door policy in the reform process, we opened Shenzhen like a special zone, a special economic zone, but here a special zone for development cooperation. Like mentioned, shall we just keep open-minded on each side, and then let's keep these procedures or skills which used be open-minded. I still remember that one trilateral cooperation like China with UNDP and then to one African countries to build up a kind of a, not a dam, but a kind of engineering, a kind of a wall. And the Chinese engineer is very, serious. They don't good at making fun, and they just using a technical way and mindset to do this work, but the work makes it very perfect. It's hard, it's engineering criteria perfect. But with UNDP criteria, they're using participatory approach. They're using farmers' way to build up the wall. So the wall means it's not technically very sound, but everyone is happy. So which criteria we have to use. We have to keep open-minded for mutual learning during the process. One hard copy for the wall is perfectly engineering perspective, but for the community, they are happy for this process. So it's a hard and a soft and combined together, and then everybody is happy. So that's my maybe to ideal, But I think that's the only way that we can cooperate. We should keep it open-minded. If we just stick to the procedures in each country, then it's impossible. I just go through a kind of a trilateral cooperation. My university and also a British university can work together to Africa study. Then in our university, they have a procedure. In British university have a procedure. So which one to follow? And we have to negotiate every day. And then, if they stick to the only way, then we cannot do it. So that's my supplement.
Thank you. I'm afraid to open up a huge area of questioning with only 10 minutes to go, but several panelists or several people in the audience have asked about, is there a way for China and say the DAC donors to cooperate on a common global challenge? Clearly, the decarbonization of the global economy is a common global challenge. Does that present a platform by which China and the DAC donors could find common ground to cooperate on their development projects? Is that going to help to have that common objective? Professor Zha.
Yes, climate change, health, and whatnot. I refrained from answering previous ones. Actually, there are some past mini projects to look at the tripartite cooperation. China, UK, Tanzania in health, China, Australia in East Timor, also in health, China, in the UK and Uganda in agriculture, China, UNESCO, and in African Union in university education. There are lots of these mini projects. Probably somebody should launch a study to map them and review some of the cases. But then moving forward, clearly, I can see several issue areas where China and what you can call Western or traditional donors or OECD donors can cooperate or should cooperate. One is health provision, health. Secondly, is climate change. The third, actually, in a very strange way, I actually think it's a supply chain management, because supply chain management should not be left to this populist government policies around the world. Development, after all, ought to have the interests of the people in mind. If we in the development field don't factor in the possible impact of sudden jolts due to the kind of populism-driven politics, then we're going to be shortchanging ourselves. for sure. And I'll be happy, institutions like mine would be happy to work with colleagues like you yourself to further some of the more discussions. Hopefully something concrete can turn up.
Someone else want to comment? Church on
Yeah,
this?
if I may, I think, well, first, I am deeply convinced that even more in the light of, let's say, the challenges which have been created or accelerated by the COVID-19 crisis, that the only way out in order to have the chance to address effectively this is to work together, China and the group of DAC or Western, as you wish. I don't like this definition, but we understand each other. I think this is the only way. This implies, and the experience that I've done is that if we are able to, let's say, to build a space which is a bit more common in terms of language, in terms of pragmatic approach, we are very close to do it. I don't want to say, because we are not to be cheap, there are a lot of political difficulties, but I think that in the areas of, let's say, helping those which are poorer or in any case trapped into traps, for example, like many middle-income countries, it is really common interest to do it. And therefore, to show that it's possible to advance concretely can give also some push to more difficult political agenda. I think climate is true, but climate should not become, let's say, a generic way. It should mean to have capacity to develop national plans to decarbonize the economy. Are concrete plans in order to train labor forces which should be able to cope with the new skills. The education agenda is very important. It means that, for example, not only in climate change, but there is another area in which I think we have, let's say, in the world, common interest is to address security and development issues. If I've seen what, let's say, the Westerners and the Chinese are doing in area of Africa, I know very well, in fact, these are converging, but actually the mechanism of delivering are still fragmented. But the agenda of security and development is extremely, is one which can connect more than others in concrete terms. So in short, I think that one, it is necessary, a reason why I think it is necessary to make an effort to find some form of common language and criteria. And obviously, it's on the two sides, but more transparency on the Chinese side is necessary, because in any case, it cannot be only, let's say, inward looking, because it is obvious that we have to identify something which is more in common. And on the other side, just to get rid of what is the more traditional and, of ours. Second point is to go concretely in countries for climate change in particular, in country, capacity and bottlenecks in countries, and on security and development, in my view, is particularly important, because this is peace and war. And I think that, this remains a common agenda between China and the more traditional, if I may say that this way. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. We're almost out of time. Ranil, you were the presenter and represent the coalition of authors, if you will. Let me give you a chance to comment on this interesting discussion, and I'll make one last comment and we'll wrap up. Ranil.
Thanks, Mark. It's impossible to summarize the rich discussion in one final comment, so I'm not going to attempt to do that. I think I would just like to highlight one point and make one final point. The point I'd like to highlight is that a lot of these panelists have spoken a little bit about the experience that China had in receiving aid and how that shaped the way that it's organized, conceptualized, etc. And I think that's really important. And one of the reasons why it's so important is because right now there's a whole bunch of other countries that are all receiving aid from a different main donor or from a different group of donors, and all of them have slightly different experiences of how aid is coming into their country, how it's being organized, etc. And that's not wholly represented in the way that all of us talk about how you do aid. It's very, very much from a donor perspective, whether it's from China or from the OECD or from a bilateral organization. But the point that I would finally like to make, and the final point I would like to make is that if we're really serious about thinking about trilateral cooperation, and we're really serious about better coordination and constructing a common language, one of the key interlocutors of this is going to be the recipient country, and we have to redistribute agency from the various donors to the recipients. They are the people who can, they're the only people who are hearing from both sides, and they can tell us what they want. They can tell us how they think things fit better together. And historically, no donor has done a very brilliant job of doing that. And I feel that that's probably the sort of the margin I would like us to work more on in the future.
Thank you, Ranil. I mean, I hear very much that in some senses, there's a long tradition. Each China and the ODA donors, if you will, the DAC donors come from long traditions of having clearly relations with developing countries and understanding the process of development. And one of the questions that we didn't get to that I think is very interesting is you see in many developing countries more and more openness to industrial policy, so-called industrial policy, and state intervention in the economy. This is something that has been anathema to the Western donors, if you will, for a long time, and it's some place where an area where China has been very successful. Again, it's an area perhaps of common accord, but I agree with all sides that we need a more common language. I think we've made a very, very small start to that common language here today, and I want to thank all the panelists for putting this on the table. I wish we could go for another 2 hours. I think we started a very interesting conversation, but we will find a way to do that. Thanks to each of you for your contributions, and many thanks to our audience for listening to us today. And we look forward to having you all at future Center for Global Development events. Thank you very much. We'll close here.